This week on Act Out, you may know the corporate media lies to you, but do you know how? Here's a look at one of their favorite techniques, plus what you'll never hear covered on the nightly news, i.e. Uncle Sam's very own climate refugees, how much of the planet's forests we have left, and pipeline battles from the front lines. Two folks from Appalachians Against Pipelines join us to talk backstory, updates, and inspiration in the face of a 300-mile-long proposed pipeline. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So you might think that if we're starting off with headlines this week, we should start by talking about Cambridge Analytica and the firestorm that shoved even the Zuck himself into the spotlight to meekly say, "Our bad." But no, I have nothing to add to this shit because I've already covered it. At risk of sounding like a hipster, I covered that shit before mainstream media thought it was cool. And I'm not even OG in that sense. Activist comedian Lee Camp covered Cambridge Analytica on his show literally a year ago. Like, almost the day. So if you're jonesing for some coverage on this Orwellian mind-gaming fash-supporting company, take a look at that episode, and also take a look at the article that I wrote regarding our stolen elections in Truthdig last month. And we'll link to both of those in the show description and at the end of the show. But before we leave our limping infotainment catastrophe of media system behind, let's take a look at something that they love talking about. War. Although they don't really call it that. In fact, according to a recent report by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, modernizing is the chic way of referring to military buildup. Citing examples from the likes of CNN, Reuters, and the New York Times, FAIR shows how the media has, for almost 100 years, used the term modernize to describe the rise and subsidization of U.S. empire and our unprovoked crusades across the globe. The media must frame the U.S. as always reacting to military escalations by others. The U.S. military is simply updating its massive arsenal, as you would your iPhone software, an inevitable and therefore not at all hostile act. And speaking of the New York Times, in a brilliant and scathing letter to the new head of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, Andrew Bacevich remarks on the narrow perspective that this behemoth media company takes with regards to war, namely the, quote, normalization of armed conflict, with your writers, editors, and an editorial board having tacitly accepted that, for the United States, war has become a permanent condition. And that, when it comes to recent American wars, the Times offers coverage without perspective. All the news is shallow and redundant. Bacevich goes on to pose 6 questions that the Times writers could and should consider in order to give some much-needed perspective to our perpetual warmongering, such as, what is the overall objective in this no-name war? He concludes his suggestions with a single sentence of beauty that really should be echoed to every single media outlet in the country. Here's a small proposition. Just for a single day, confine Donald Trump to page A17 and give our no-name war the attention that the Times normally reserves for the president it loathes. Ooh, all the feels. Now, if you watch this show, you probably already knew that mainstream media was rotten. But do your friends and family a favor and share this little snippet with them. Because we all need reminding, and indeed many need waking up. Because corporate media is not your friend. They have and will continue to perpetuate pain and suffering for the profit of the empire elites that they dutifully serve. As another example, here's a story that you won't see flying from the smizing faces of corporate media's talking heads this evening. A new World Bank report estimates that by 2050, 140 million climate refugees will be migrating from areas ravaged by climate change. And that's apparently a conservative estimate. While the report focused on 3 areas in the quote-unquote developing world, the U.S., in our exceptional manner, already has climate refugees. Take that, World Bank. In southern Louisiana, the coastal indigenous community of Isle de Jean Charles is sinking. Well, it has been sinking for the last 90 years. When the band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw Indians arrived in the early 1800s, they settled on the highest ridge in the area, located on Isle de Jean Charles. In 1955, the island measured 22,400 acres. Now only 320 acres remain. And while HUD offered some relocation grants to families on the island, the red tape only strengthened many of the locals' distrust in the government. 100 people or less remain on the island, and as Louisiana's government continues to give the okay for more and more destruction to the wetlands, they'll likely be the last to ever live on the island before it entirely disappears. When I asked a woman in Puerto Rico if she thought any of the thousands of people would come back to the island, she ironically laughed. What would they come back to? And while Puerto Rico isn't disappearing into the ocean just yet, it certainly disappeared from the radar of U.S. empire interest. Not that it was ever really that present. Federal help isn't on the way for these communities, particularly as they are Black, brown, and indigenous. Community help and solidarity, action from knowledge and engagement from giving a fuck are our tools, and we best get to sharpening them. Because despite our best efforts at recycling and foregoing cuddles for the sake of shorter showers, nature is dying. According to new studies produced by Nature Communications, trees in the tropical regions are dying twice as fast as they did 35 years ago, and 4/5 of the Earth's remaining woodlands are now in some way degraded by human activities. This figure, researchers warn, is probably an underestimate. Trees are vital to human survival due to their ability to mitigate warming in converting CO2 to oxygen, something that we need to survive. Scientists call forests vital stabilizers in the fight to mitigate human-created climate change, and as James Watson of the University of Queensland and the World Conservation Society noted, forest conservation must be prioritized based on their relative values, and Earth's remaining forests are the crown jewels, ones that global climate and biodiversity policies must now emphasize. And speaking of trees, I do actually have some good news. Last week, a federal judge barred Duke and Dominion Energy's latest project, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, from cutting down trees on 2 rural homesteads in Nash County, North Carolina. The 600-mile-long proposed pipeline threatens some 1,000 homes and farms in North Carolina alone, and that's not to mention the land that's not part of homes and farms. U.S. District Judge Terrence Boyle sided with property owners against ACP's pleas that they gotta hurry up and clear trees before March 31st or risk delaying construction until next winter. And while this is very welcome and good news, it isn't a total win. Any pipeline resistor knows that the legal battle is only one tactic, a piece of the overall fight. For example, last week on the 23rd day of the Peters Mountain tree sit in West Virginia, a judge ruled against the Mountain Valley Pipeline who had sought an injunction against the tree sitters. The judge ultimately, and rather surprisingly, sided with Appalachians Against Pipelines, the group organizing the tree sit, agreeing that there wasn't enough evidence to show that the tree sitters were in the direct path of the proposed pipeline. Despite this good news, an attempted extraction could come any day. On February 26th, Forest Service police informed the tree sitters that they had 21 days to remain in their sits based on federal legislation that places limits on a campsite. And the court ruling, which came down on March 20th, again marked 23 days in the trees. On Thursday the 22nd, supporters worried that an extraction would be attempted as authorities headed towards the tree sits. By the afternoon, new notices had been posted on trees prohibiting anyone to be within 100 feet of the pipeline right-of-way. But as the taping of this show on Monday, March 26th, no extraction has been attempted. And despite sub-zero temperatures and high winds, the folks that I spoke to are resolute in their long-term efforts to stop this pipeline, and more. In a post from last Friday, Appalachians Against Pipelines wrote, "Our motivations are embedded in a world in which fossil fuel extraction threatens life on this earth as we know it. For the young people sitting in these trees, we see no promising future to grow old in. It's been sold away. So we demand nothing short of the abolition of fossil fuels along with the exploitation that its extraction necessitates. And we say demand, knowing too well that no representative of authority will give it to us. We'll have to author this path for ourselves. We look instead to our ancestors and those who have fought extractive industries all along, knowing that this includes workers who struggled from the inside." Late last week, we talked to a person called May, who's on the ground on Peters Mountain, and a young Virginian doing one of the tree sits. Here's the situation and the backstory in their own words from the front lines.
After a lot of years, really, of community organizing along the route of MVP's planned pipeline, there's been a lot of people turning out in the sort of standard regulatory process steps. But throughout, there's been some people who've realized that the regulatory process is never going to fix the extraction problem, and that if the march of corporate progress was going to proceed with big fossil fuel projects, it was going to take direct action. It was going to take a different type of organizing to intervene and try to stop this destruction. So over the years of the pipeline trying to recruit support, trying to force people to sell them easements, over the years of the public hearings and the public comment and everything that impacted folks and, concerned people were doing, there has been kind of a loosely organized effort of doing trainings, doing networking, and just trying to prepare people in a region that hasn't really seen a big extraction fight, prepare people for what's to come now and this moment that we're in.
And talk about the community that you're in. What has been the response from people there? And talk a little bit about the affected people.
The Mountain Valley Pipeline is 300 miles long. And so it connects people across a bunch of different areas. So, first and foremost, this is all stolen land. This is all, colonized land. And so this is just a land theft that's taking place on top of hundreds of years of land theft. And a lot of the people in rural West Virginia and southwestern Virginia aren't coming into this fight with that analysis on top. They're coming because they're concerned about the corporate theft of their private property right now. And they're coming because they know that this is a dirty industry and they hate the idea that this beautiful area is getting wrecked by a company with a bad track record. And so it's all types of people. There's locals in this area hiking up through the snow to bring food to the tree sits. It's a pretty incredible community response. And those folks are retired teachers and, small families and local old farmers, and it's all kinds of different people who are maybe newer to this type of direct action tactic, but are down for the fight, and are supporting it how they can.
Do you feel that that there's hope in the legal battles, or do you feel that this is really just a direct action tactic, that's the only thing that's going to work?
Well, I think it's going to take all of it. I think it's going to take everyone, the people who are involved in the legal process are doing it with all they're able. And as is so often the case, those two different, tools of resistance and of delay are kind of working separately, but in the same direction. So I think that the direct action component is really critical. Without it, there wouldn't be the same kind of direct observation and direct work stoppage. They would have already cut the trees down and in preparation of constructing their site to bore through the mountain. I think a lot of people have the understanding that FERC is just a rubber stamp approval agency, and bringing it, there's some people calling for hearings to revisit this approval all the way up to the federal level. But I believe that, it's unlikely that FERC is going to change their tune. And a lot of people who are involved in this fight from more of a private property angle are hoping in a variety of ways to challenge the legality of a corporation using eminent domain to take people's private land for a project that is arguably, not in the public good, that is for corporate profit. But at the end of the day, it's a survival issue. I think for Appalachians Against Pipelines, largely, it's about the climate. It's about reclaiming this land that's been taken too many times, and not letting it be stolen one more time for corporate destruction.
Me and a bunch of other people have been following this pipeline construction process and permitting process since it was announced 3 years ago. And along the way, we've been, having rallies and meeting people who are landowners, and have been trying to find the little pockets of resistance that we can build out and continue to create new ways of fighting the pipeline when it was in its permitting process. And this effectively delayed the construction process considerably. But, as we kind of anticipated from the onset, it's eventually received all of its necessary permits. And just about a month ago, they began felling trees across Appalachia. We, just because the permits were issued to us, that didn't make the pipeline permissible. So we just continued doing what we've been doing this whole time and figured out how we can keep struggling against the construction of this project that we know will lead to destruction of many people's lives and livelihoods. We got to thinking about what we could do, and this is what we figured out.
So, personally, why are you up there? What made you decide that you'd like to be involved in specifically a tree sit rather than, ground support or doing something, continuing the legal battle on the ground?
With the tree sit, what's really effective about it and strategic is that it doesn't take a whole lot of people to create a whole lot of conflict for the pipeline company. Currently there are just two of us who are holding it down up here, and it's completely halted their ability to bore a hole through this mountain and continue the construction. In that sense, this tactic was really alluring, because it would also allow for us to continue fighting on other fronts. But I personally am up here because it's something I can do, and I really wanted to just wedge myself directly into the battlefield, and to use my faculties and my energy to concretely stop the construction.
How long have you been up there?
It's been 4 weeks today.
Wow. And what are your demands that you have that you'd like to see done before you would come down?
We want the total. We don't want the pipeline. So if there's nothing short of that will allow us to come down, until this pipeline is totally rendered unbuildable, and then we're going to stay up here.
Has there been any interaction with either workers or authority figures from where you've been sitting?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost every day for the last 4 or 5 days, surveyors have come along with police or Forest Service authorities. And it seems like they're measuring the distances between trees. We're not exactly sure what their intent is, but they've been out for 2 or 3 hours at least a day. Right now, there's about 8 inches of snow on the ground, and they've still come out every day to continue that work.
So what do you expect? Do you expect them to try and force you down? What are your expectations there?
I don't know. I mean, they're gonna have a really hard time doing anything up here. The slope is so significant that it's hard to even walk, let alone engage in a complicated extraction process. But they could go the route of just waiting us out, which will not be successful on their end because we're prepared to stay for as long as we need to. Or if they get desperate enough, they might try to forcibly remove us. We're prepared for either instance, though.
Talk about what you can see from up there, the construction and the destruction that's happening around you.
Yeah. So far, it's just a lot of destruction. Right now, as I look down the mountain, there's about a gaping kind of hole that scars all the way from about 20 yards from my sit down to the base of the mountain. That's just covered with felled trees or dead trees. It's devastating to see what they've done here already. And this is just the beginning. If they have their way, they'll then spray herbicides all over that parcel, and then digging up the earth and eventually trying to dig a 42-inch hole directly through the mountain itself. But we're also surrounded by beauty. The snow actually covered up that scar that they've left, and you could almost pretend that they weren't here in the first place.
And what is the ecosystem like around you? Like what's at stake here? Talk a little bit about the environment that you're in.
This mountain is so alive. Even in the winter, it's there's just an abundance of different plants and animals. In the nighttime, I can hear owls and daytime birds of all types. It swells with water. There's active springs at the top of the mountain, which I've never seen this before. But yeah, 4,000 feet up, there's springs that are just like pouring with water. And that's because this mountain is filled with karst, which is like a cavernous, almost Swiss cheese. So just beneath the topsoil of the mountain is karst, which is, it is like a Swiss cheese kind of structure that is, again, filled with running water. And this is what they're trying to drill through, which to anyone that has a bit of common sense, that's a horribly destructive and dangerous thing to be tampering with. And it will undoubtedly harm the water resources of the people that rely on this mountain and have relied on it for centuries. So we just can't allow it. There's no way that we will.
So finally, I wanted to ask how you'd like to tell people to support, but also any message that you might have to put out there to people who might be facing destructive projects in their own area.
Yeah. Here's the thing. As I look at the quote unquote construction process that they've engaged in so far, So far there's no pipe on the ground. There's nothing that indicates that this pipeline exists. And yet, the way the process is designed, it's supposed to kind of impose this reality before any construction has even begun, that the pipeline simply will occur because all the legal backing has been established. But there's literally no sign of it yet. So they have to do a whole lot to realize the construction of this project. So what I will say is that, get to talking to your neighbors, get to talking to the people around you who share a desire to stop this. There's a lot of power in our insistence to fight, even though the state is backing. Talk to your neighbors, talk to the people that you share a life with, and get to thinking about what it can look like to continue to resist, and what it can look like to build life in the way of this destruction, which is what we're doing here.
So one of those lines really struck me: to build life in the way of destruction. Because in that, so much of what we talked about today, or indeed in any episode, is encompassed. The work of building, of nurturing life and protecting each other and our home in the midst of this capitalist suicidal freefall. It is the most important work that we can do, and support others as they do the same. You can go directly to bit.ly/support MVP resistance, and we'll have that link in the show description as well. Also check out the show description to see where you can get updates on the Peter Mountain Tree Sit and other sites that we mentioned in this week's show. And with that, we will wrap this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Remember that this show airs online as well as on Free Speech TV every weekend. For interim updates, please check out and follow us on social media. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and shoved my shove. I'm not a violent man, but